Story 1. The Echoes in the Silence. Samantha had always found comfort in the quiet. Her small house on the outskirts of a sleepy town was the perfect retreat from the chaos of the world. The streets were often empty, the neighbors distant but polite, and the nights were filled with a silence so deep it was almost palpable. After long days working at the local library, she would come home, lock the door behind her, and bask in the stillness that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. But lately, the silence had begun to change. It started with small things, a creak in the floorboards, a rustle of leaves outside her window, the faintest hint of a whisper in the air. At first, Samantha dismissed these sounds as the natural settling of an old house, or the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as the days turned into weeks, the noises grew more persistent, more deliberate. One Friday evening, as the sky darkened and rain began to fall in a steady drizzle, Samantha came home feeling particularly worn out. The cold outside seemed to seep into her bones, making her eager to get inside, where it was warm and quiet. She locked the front door behind her, kicked off her shoes, and headed to the kitchen to make a simple dinner. Tonight was supposed to be just like any other evening of solitude, with nothing but the silence to keep her company. But that night, the silence was different. As Samantha settled onto the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she noticed it. A strange, oppressive heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She flipped through the channels on the TV, but nothing caught her interest. Eventually, she settled on an old movie she had seen a dozen times before, hoping the familiarity would ease the unease gnawing at the edges of her mind. Halfway through the movie, Samantha began to feel drowsy. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she was just beginning to drift off when a sound pulled her back to wakefulness. It was faint, barely audible over the low hum of the TV, but it was there, a soft, scratching noise, like something brushing against the side of the house. She sat up, suddenly alert, her heart beginning to race. The sound came again, this time closer, as if whatever was making it was moving along the outside wall, inching toward the window. Samantha muted the TV, and the silence in the room grew thick and heavy, pressing in on her from all sides. She strained to listen, every nerve in her body on edge. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, until it stopped just beneath the window. Samantha held her breath, waiting, but the noise didn't come again. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. She tried to tell herself it was just a branch scraping against the siding, or perhaps an animal seeking shelter from the rain. But deep down, she knew it was something more. Something that had no business being outside her house in the dead of night. She considered calling the police, but dismissed the idea just as quickly. What would she say? That she heard a noise? They would think she was overreacting, or worse, that she was imagining things. So instead, she sat there, frozen, waiting for the noise to come back. When it didn't, she let out a shaky breath and tried to relax. But the unease lingered, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach that wouldn't go away. An hour passed, and Samantha finally convinced herself that it was nothing, that she was safe. She turned the TV back on, trying to lose herself in the movie, but her mind kept drifting back to that sound, that eerie, deliberate scratching. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, it came again. This time, it was louder, closer, right outside the back door. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she muted the TV once more. The sound was unmistakable now, a series of slow, scraping noises, as if something was trying to find its way inside. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading to the back of the house. The silence was suffocating, wrapping around her like a vice, and she could feel her heart hammering in her chest. The scratching moved to the back door, and Samantha realized with a jolt of terror that she had forgotten to lock it when she came home. She cursed herself for being so careless, for letting her guard down. Now, whatever was outside was trying to get in. Her mind raced, thinking of all the possibilities: an animal, a prankster, or something far worse. She didn't have any weapons, and her phone was on the kitchen counter, too far away to reach without making noise. If she moved, whoever or whatever was outside might hear her. The door handle rattled, and fear gripped Samantha like a vice. She knew she had to do something, but her body refused to move. She stayed frozen on the couch, her eyes wide with terror, as the door creaked open inch by inch. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the back door was now slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Just the yawning blackness of the open door and the silence pressing in on her. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep, followed by another and another. Someone was inside the house. Panic surged through her, and she slid off the couch as quietly as she could, moving toward the kitchen where her phone was. She knew she had to call the police, but any sound might alert whoever was inside. Her hands were trembling as she reached the kitchen counter, the cold, smooth surface a lifeline in the darkness. The footsteps were getting closer, moving through the house with a slow, deliberate pace. Whoever it was, they were checking each room, methodically, as if searching for something or someone. Samantha grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. She whispered her address to the operator, barely audible, her voice shaking with fear. She hung up quickly, hoping the police would arrive in time. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen, and Samantha held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her. But the intruder stepped into the kitchen, their shadow stretching across the floor, moving closer to where she was hiding. She knew she had to act. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze landed on a heavy frying pan on the stove, and she reached for it slowly, trying not to make a sound. Just as her fingers closed around the handle, the intruder turned the corner and saw her. For a brief second, their eyes locked, and Samantha felt a wave of cold, paralyzing fear. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled low over his face. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion, and Samantha knew in that moment that he wouldn't hesitate to hurt her. Without thinking, she swung the frying pan as hard as she could. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man stumbled back, clutching his head. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She bolted out of the kitchen and ran toward the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the door, she heard the man getting up behind her. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps were quick, angry, closing in on her. Finally, the lock clicked, and Samantha threw the door open, sprinting into the cold night. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the street, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She glanced back to see if he was following her, but the street was empty. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Moments later, she heard sirens in the distance. The police arrived and searched the house, but the intruder was gone. They told her she was lucky to have escaped unharmed, but Samantha didn't feel lucky. She felt shaken, violated, and terrified. That night changed everything. The silence that Samantha once found comforting had become a constant reminder of how vulnerable she was. Every time she heard a noise, no matter how small, her heart would race, fearing that the intruder had returned. She knew that she could never stay in that house again. The silence, once her refuge, was now her tormentor, and she could never shake the feeling that something or someone was always watching, always waiting in the darkness. In the days that followed, Samantha tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The police had assured her that they would patrol the area more frequently, but it did little to ease her mind. The fear had taken root deep inside her, and it refused to let go. She began staying with friends, unwilling to return to the house alone. They were sympathetic, offering her a place to stay as long as she needed, but Samantha could see the worry in their eyes, the way they whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. They didn't understand the depth of her fear, didn't know how the silence haunted her, how it followed her everywhere she went. One evening, as she sat in her friend's living room, the TV playing softly in the background, Samantha felt a sudden wave of panic. The room was too quiet to still. She could hear every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a clock. It was all too familiar, too much like the silence that had filled her own house on that terrible night. Her breath quickened, and she clenched her fists, trying to calm herself. But the fear was overwhelming, suffocating her, until she couldn't take it anymore. She stood abruptly, startling her friend. "I need to get some fresh air," she said, her voice trembling. Her friend looked at her with concern, but nodded. "Do you want me to come with you?" Samantha shook her head, already heading for the door. "No, I'll be fine. I just need to be alone for a bit." She stepped outside into the cool evening air, taking deep breaths to steady herself. The street was quiet, the houses dark, the only light coming from the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. Samantha walked slowly, her mind racing. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The quiet was too complete, too unnatural. There were no cars passing by, no voices from inside the houses. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting around nervously. The fear that had been simmering just beneath the surface now bubbled over, turning into full-blown panic. She wanted to go back, to return to the safety of her friend's house, but something kept her moving forward, an inexplicable urge pulling her toward her own home. When she finally reached the house, it loomed before her, dark and silent, just as she had left it. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct told her to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. She had to know, had to face whatever it was that haunted her. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. The key felt cold in her hand as she unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down her spine. The darkness inside was almost palpable, pressing in on her as she stepped over the threshold. Samantha stood in the entryway listening. The silence was suffocating, thicker than she remembered, filled with a tension that made her skin crawl. She reached for the light switch, but when she flicked it, nothing happened. The house remained dark. A cold knot of fear settled in her stomach as she realized the power was out. She fumbled in her bag for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the hallway. The beam of light was small and weak, barely cutting through the darkness. As she moved deeper into the house, her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside set her nerves on edge. The silence was deafening, a heavy weight pressing down on her, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. She reached the living room, the room where it had all started. The furniture was just as she had left it, the TV still on its stand, the blanket folded neatly on the couch. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too cold, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the room, something metallic, like blood. Samantha's hand shook as she swept the flashlight beam across the room, searching for the source of the smell. It was then that she noticed the vase. The same vase that had been sitting on the coffee table the night of the break-in, now lying shattered on the floor. She took a step forward, her foot crunching on the broken pieces. The sound echoed through the silent house, louder than it should have been, making her jump. She knelt down, her heart pounding, and picked up one of the shards. It was then that she saw it, a dark, sticky substance smeared on the floor beneath the shards. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. Blood. Samantha's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. What was happening? Why was there blood in her house? Had the intruder come back? Was he still here? The questions spun through her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She needed to get out, needed to call the police, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creak of a floorboard. It was coming from upstairs. Samantha's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone. The intruder was still in the house. She stood up slowly, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. She took a step back, her eyes fixed on the staircase at the end of the hallway. The silence pressed in on her, so thick and heavy it was almost suffocating. And then, just as she was about to turn and run, she saw it, a shadow at the top of the stairs. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A dark shape moving in the shadows, watching her. Panic surged through Samantha, and she turned and bolted for the front door. Her heart raced as she fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer, and she could feel the presence closing in on her, cold and malevolent. Finally, the lock clicked, and Samantha yanked the door open, sprinting out into the night. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked back, expecting to see the intruder chasing after her, but the street was empty. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, just as it had been when she arrived. But Samantha knew she hadn't imagined it. Something had been in the house with her. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. She told the operator what had happened, her voice shaking with fear, and they assured her that officers were on their way. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls as they searched the house. But they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The blood on the floor was gone, as if it had never been there. The broken vase had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. It was as if the house itself had erased all evidence of what had happened. Samantha tried to explain, tried to make the officers understand, but they just looked at her with pity, their expressions sympathetic but disbelieving. They told her she was safe, that there was nothing to worry about, but Samantha knew better. She could still feel it, the presence lurking in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to return. The silence, once her refuge, had become her tormentor, and she knew she could never escape it. The police left, and Samantha found herself alone on the dark, empty street. She looked back at the house, its windows like dark, empty eyes staring back at her, and she knew she could never go back. The silence had taken something from her, something she could never get back. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. And as she walked, she could feel it, the presence, following her, haunting her, a shadow in the darkness that would never let her go. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. The forest had always called to them. It wasn't just the serenity of the tall, ancient trees, or the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was something more, something that tugged at their curiosity and whispered to the darker corners of their minds. For Jason, Lena, Alex, and Miranda, The forest was their escape. They were college friends, bound together by a shared love of adventure and a desire to leave behind the stress of exams and the suffocating routine of everyday life. So when Jason suggested a weekend hike in a part of the forest that was less traveled, they all jumped at the chance. "It's supposed to be really beautiful out there," Jason had said, his eyes glinting with excitement as he showed them the map. "Barely anyone goes that deep into the woods, so it'll be like our own private adventure." Lena, always the cautious one, had hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe? I mean, there's a reason people don't go there, right?" "Don't worry," Jason had reassured her with a grin. "We'll be fine. We've hiked tougher trails before. Besides, this place is supposed to be incredible. It'll be worth it." Miranda and Alex had sided with Jason, eager for a challenge and the promise of a weekend far from the noise and pressure of campus life. In the end, Lena had agreed, though a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings she couldn't quite ignore. They set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, their backpacks loaded with supplies and their spirits high. The drive to the trailhead took them deeper into the countryside, where the roads grew narrower and the towns more sparse. By the time they arrived, the sun was already climbing high into the sky, and the forest stood before them like a dark, impenetrable wall. Jason led the way, his enthusiasm infectious as they started down the trail. The path was well trodden at first, winding through groves of towering pines and dense underbrush. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine needles and earth, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. For the first few hours, they hiked in companionable silence, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly beautiful tree or the glimpse of a stream through the trees. But as the day wore on, the trail grew more difficult, the path narrowing and the trees closing in around them. It was then that they came to a fork in the trail. One path was marked with a faded wooden sign pointing toward a popular viewpoint, while the other was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and brambles. "This is it," Jason said, pointing to the overgrown path. "This is the one that leads to the hidden trail I was telling you about." Lena frowned as she peered down the narrow, unmarked path. It looked dark and foreboding, the trees growing so close together that the sunlight barely reached the ground. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "Come on, Lena," Alex said, clapping her on the shoulder. "Where's your sense of adventure? It's just a bit of overgrown forest." "We can handle it," Miranda nodded in agreement. "Besides, it's not like we're going into the wild." "We'll be fine." Lena sighed but didn't argue further. She adjusted her backpack and followed the others as they turned onto the narrow, unmarked trail. The path was rough, with roots and rocks jutting out at odd angles, making the hike slow and treacherous. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew cooler, and the light took on a strange, greenish hue as it filtered through the dense canopy. The trees seemed older here, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a nearly impenetrable wall of foliage. The underbrush was thick and tangled, and the trail was barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves and moss. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The cheerful chatter that had filled the air earlier was replaced by an uneasy quiet, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching through the leaves. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, her heart pounding as she searched the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the dense, silent forest, stretching out endlessly in all directions. After what felt like hours of trudging through the thick underbrush, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its massive trunk covered in thick, gnarled roots that twisted and coiled like the tentacles of some ancient creature. The tree's bark was dark and rough, and the leaves above were so dense that they blocked out nearly all the sunlight, casting the clearing in deep, unnatural shadow. Jason paused, glancing around the clearing with a look of satisfaction. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "This is what I wanted to show you guys. Isn't it amazing?" The others nodded, though their expressions were more subdued. There was something unsettling about the place, something that set their nerves on edge. The silence here was different from the rest of the forest, deeper, more complete, as if the clearing was cut off from the rest of the world. As they stood there, taking in the eerie beauty of the ancient tree, Lena noticed something strange. Carved into the trunk of the oak were strange symbols, deep gouges that looked almost like runes. The symbols were old, their edges worn and weathered, but they were still distinct, standing out starkly against the dark bark. "Jason, what are these?" Lena asked, pointing to the carvings. Jason stepped closer, squinting at the symbols. "I don't know," he admitted. "They look like some kind of runes, maybe? I've never seen anything like them before." Miranda frowned as she examined the carvings. "They give me the creeps. Maybe we should get out of here." Jason chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a tree. Nothing to be afraid of. Besides, aren't you curious about what they mean?" Lena shook her head, her unease growing with every passing moment. "I don't like this place, Jason. I think we should go back," but Jason wasn't ready to leave. He was too intrigued by the mystery of the symbols, too caught up in the excitement of their discovery. "Just a little longer," he said, already moving around the tree to explore further. Lena, Miranda, and Alex exchanged uneasy glances but followed him, their footsteps crunching through the thick layer of leaves that covered the ground. As they circled the tree, Lena's unease deepened. The symbols weren't just carved into the trunk, they were everywhere. They covered the roots, the low-hanging branches, even the stones that were scattered around the base of the tree. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to mark every inch of the clearing with these strange, cryptic runes. And then she heard it, a whisper, so faint that she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but there was something in it that made her blood run cold. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to hear it again. But the whispering had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence of the clearing. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Alex asked, glancing around. It sounded like someone whispering. Miranda frowned, her expression uneasy. "I didn't hear anything." Jason shook his head. "Probably just the wind. There's nothing out here, Lena. You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But Lena wasn't convinced. The whispering had sounded real to be just her imagination. And as they continued to explore the clearing, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, until it was almost unbearable. Finally, Jason seemed to sense the unease of the group and reluctantly agreed to leave the clearing. They turned back toward the path, retracing their steps through the dense underbrush. But as they walked, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The forest seemed different now, darker and more menacing. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The trail that had been so clear before was now barely visible, as if the forest was closing in around them, trying to swallow them whole. And then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just off the path. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. For a moment, they all froze, their hearts pounding in unison. "Who's there?" Jason called out, his voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching them, its presence sending a chill down their spines. Miranda grabbed Jason's arm, her voice trembling. "Jason, let's go. We need to get out of here." But Jason didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Then slowly, the figure began to move, stepping out of the shadows and into the faint light that filtered through the trees. It was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. His clothes were old and tattered, hanging off his thin frame like rags. Lena gasped, her heart racing as the man took a step toward them. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Jason's arm and pulling him back down the trail. They all turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they raced through the forest. The trees whipped past them in a blur of green and brown, their branches clawing at their clothes as if trying to hold them back. But no matter how fast they ran, the man was always there, just out of sight, always following them. His footsteps were silent, but they could feel his presence, could sense him closing in on them with every passing moment. Their fear drove them deeper into the forest, the trail twisting and turning as it led them further away from the safety of the clearing. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the trees closing in, the shadows deepening, until they were completely lost. They stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. But this clearing was different. It was darker, more sinister, the trees around it taller and more twisted, their branches knotted together like the fingers of a giant hand. And in the center of the clearing stood another tree, even older and more gnarled than the one they had seen before. This one was covered in the same strange runes, but they were deeper, more pronounced. As if they had been carved with a heavy hand, Jason fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is happening?" he panted. "Why can't we get out of here?" Lena looked around, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of the man who had been following them. But there was nothing, just the trees, the runes, and the oppressive silence. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here," but Alex shook his head, his face pale with fear. "We're lost, Lena. We've been going in circles. We're never getting out of here." Miranda collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore. I just want to go home." Lena knelt beside her, trying to comfort her, but her own fear was threatening to overwhelm her. She glared over at Jason, who was still staring at the tree, his expression blank and distant. "Jason, we need to go," she said, her voice trembling. But he didn't respond. He just kept staring at the tree, as if he were in a trance, and then she heard it again, the whispering. It was louder this time, clearer, and it was coming from all around them, as if the trees themselves were speaking. Lena's heart raced as she looked around, trying to find the source of the whispers. But there was nothing, no one, just the trees, and the runes and the shadows that seemed to be closing in on them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. It filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts, overwhelming her senses. She tried to cover her ears, to block it out, but it was no use. The whispers were inside her head, seeping into her mind like poison. She looked at her friends, but they were all frozen, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies rigid with fear. The whispers had taken hold of them too, and they were powerless to resist. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than the whispers had been. Lena's ears rang with the absence of sound, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. But then she saw the man, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them with those hollow, empty eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his presence more terrifying than any sound. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the man wasn't just following them. He was leading them, guiding them deeper into the forest, into the heart of the darkness, and they had followed him, like lambs to the slaughter. She opened her mouth to scream, to warn the others, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, stolen by the whispers, and all she could do was watch as the man took a step toward them. But this time, something was different. The man's eyes weren't empty anymore. They were filled with something dark and malevolent, something that made Lena's blood run cold. He took another step, and then another, until he was standing right in front of them, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. Lena tried to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, trapped by the man's gaze, by the darkness that radiated from him like a physical force. And then he spoke, his voice a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his words dripping with menace. "This place is not for you." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to speak, to plead for their lives, but the words wouldn't come. The man's eyes bored into hers, and she felt a cold, icy dread wash over her. He wasn't human, he couldn't be. There was something inhuman about him, something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for them in the darkness of the forest. And now that it had them, it wasn't going to let them go. Lena's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. They were trapped, surrounded by the trees, the ruins, and the darkness that had been waiting for them all along. And then the man reached out, his hand cold and clammy as it touched her skin. The last thing Lena saw before the darkness took her was the man's eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, filled with the promise of something far worse than death. Story 3. The Intruder. There was something unsettling about coming home to an empty house every night, especially after a long shift. Nathan had always enjoyed the quiet that came with living alone, the way the silence wrapped around him, like a cocoon as soon as he stepped through the front door. But lately, that silence had started to feel more oppressive than comforting. It started with the small things. A mug that wasn't where he left it. A door he was sure he'd closed swinging open. The keys he always left on the kitchen counter, mysteriously appearing in the living room. Nathan brushed them off at first, just signs of a tired mind, maybe the result of long hours at work. But as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, Nathan came home to find his front door slightly ajar. He paused on the doorstep, a chill running down his spine. He could have sworn he'd locked it that morning. He always did, out of habit. But now the door was open, just a crack, as if someone had been careless when they left. For a moment, Nathan considered calling the police. But then he shook his head, dismissing the idea. He was probably just being paranoid. Maybe he hadn't pulled the door all the way closed. Maybe the wind had blown it open. He stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. The house was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp he kept on in the hallway. The familiar scent of old wood and the faintest hint of something floral left over from the air freshener he rarely used greeted him as he walked in. But something else lingered too, something he couldn't quite place. A faint, almost imperceptible scent that made his skin prickle. He checked the house, room by room, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place. The windows were all closed, the back door locked. It was just as he had left it. Still, the unease wouldn't leave him. That night, Nathan barely slept. Every creak, every groan of the old house set his nerves on edge. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind outside rustled the trees, and a distant car alarm wailed before being abruptly silenced. But inside, the house was quiet, unnervingly so. In the early hours of the morning, just as he was finally beginning to drift off, Nathan heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creak of a floorboard. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened, straining to hear anything else, but the house had fallen silent again. For a long moment, Nathan lay there, his body tense, every muscle coiled with fear. But the sound didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion overcame his fear, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, Nathan awoke with a sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was lurking just out of sight. As he got ready for work, he found himself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure before he left. But the unease lingered, a constant, gnawing presence at the back of his mind. That night, the unease turned to fear. Nathan came home late, the winter darkness already settled in by the time he pulled into his driveway. The street was quiet, the houses dark, save for the occasional porch light. He stepped out of his car, pulling his coat tighter against the cold, and made his way up the front steps. As soon as he opened the door, he knew something was wrong. The house was cold, the air inside almost frigid, as if a window had been left open all day. But more than that, there was a sense of something off, something out of place. Nathan's heart began to race as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He stood in the hallway, listening, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The house was silent, but it wasn't the comforting silence he was used to. It was the kind of silence that filled a room after something had happened, a silence that seemed to hum with tension. Nathan took a step forward, then another, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. He made his way to the living room, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of the ordinary. But everything was in its place, just as it had been when he left that morning. He was about to turn and head to the kitchen when something caught his eye. The small decorative vase that usually sat on the coffee table was gone. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as he looked around, searching for it. It wasn't on the floor. It hadn't been knocked over. It was just gone. Nathan's pulse quickened as he made his way to the kitchen. The door was open, swinging slightly as if someone had just passed through it. His hands shook as he reached for the light switch, flooding the room with a harsh white light. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was unlocked. Nathan stared at it, his mind racing. He knew he had locked it. He always locked it. He took a step toward the door, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But then he stopped, frozen in place by a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Someone had been in his house. Someone had been here while he was gone, moving through his rooms, touching his things. The thought made his skin crawl, made his blood run cold. He backed out of the kitchen, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just the cold, empty house, filled with the eerie silence that had become all too familiar. Nathan grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. His voice shook as he told the operator what had happened, his eyes never leaving the dark hallway that led to the back of the house. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls as they searched the house. But they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Nathan felt a sense of relief when the officers left, but it was short-lived. The fear had taken root, and it refused to let go. He knew something was wrong. Something was out there, watching him, waiting. Over the next few days, Nathan became increasingly paranoid. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside his window set his nerves on edge. He found himself checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. Then, one night, he woke to a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a soft, deliberate scraping, like something sharp being dragged across wood. Nathan's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay there, listening, the sound growing louder, closer. He sat up in bed, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. But the sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the suffocating silence in its wake. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he climbed out of bed, his legs trembling as he made his way to the door. He opened it slowly, peering into the dark hallway. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. But then he heard it again, a soft, scraping sound, coming from the direction of the living room. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as he crept down the hallway, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He reached the living room and stopped dead in his tracks. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But there was something wrong, something that made his skin crawl. The coffee table had been moved, pushed aside as if someone had been trying to get underneath it. And in the middle of the floor, where the table had been, was the vase that had gone missing days ago. It was lying on its side, a small crack running down its side, as if it had been dropped. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the vase, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't moved the table, hadn't touched the vase. Someone had been here, in his house, moving things, leaving them for him to find, and then he heard the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind him. Nathan spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no one there, just the dark hallway, stretching out into the shadows. He backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He needed to get out, needed to get away from whatever was in his house. But as he turned to leave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, he saw a figure standing just behind him, its face obscured by the shadows. It was tall, its form thin and gaunt, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Nathan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him, its eyes locked onto his. Panic surged through Nathan as he turned and bolted for the front door. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he tried to open it. But before he could get it open, he felt a cold, clammy hand close around his wrist, pulling him back into the darkness. He screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the darkened house, reverberating off the walls like the cry of a doomed man. The grip on his wrist tightened, cold and unyielding, dragging him back into the shadows of the hallway. Nathan fought against the unseen force, his free hand clawing at the wall, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing to grab, nothing to stop the relentless pull that was drawing him deeper into the house. The air around him grew colder, the chill sinking into his bones, sapping the strength from his limbs. His vision blurred as panic seized him, his mind racing, desperately searching for a way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed him, the hand let go. Nathan stumbled forward, crashing to the floor, gasping for breath. He scrambled to his feet, spinning around to face the hallway. It was empty. He stood there, panting, his chest heaving as he stared into the darkness. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The hallway was silent, the house eerily still, the only sound the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat. Nathan's mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had felt the cold, clammy grip on his wrist, the pressure of fingers digging into his skin. It had been real as the fear that still gripped him. But now there was nothing. No sign of the figure, no trace of the force that had pulled him into the darkness. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating him. Nathan took a step back, his foot bumping against something on the floor. He looked down, his breath catching in his throat. The vase that had been on the living room floor was now lying at his feet, shattered into countless pieces. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the fact that the shards were arranged in a perfect circle, as if someone or something had carefully placed them there. His hands began to tremble as he stared at the circle of broken porcelain, the jagged edges glinting in the dim light. He couldn't take his eyes off it, couldn't move, couldn't think. The silence pressed in on him, heavier than ever, and with it came a feeling of dread, so intense that it made his skin crawl. He knew, deep down, that he wasn't alone in the house. There was something there, something watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of the house, but his body wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest, the fear almost paralyzing, and then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow moving along the wall, just at the edge of his vision. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He turned his head, his breath catching in his throat, but the shadow was gone. Nathan's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The darkness seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the air growing thick and oppressive. He could feel his pulse racing, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, and then the footsteps started again. Soft, deliberate, coming from the direction of the living room. They were slow, unhurried, the sound of someone or something moving with purpose. Each step was measured, calculated, sending a shiver down Nathan's spine. He took a step back, his foot crunching on the broken shards of the vase. The sound seemed to echo through the house, louder than it should have been, like a gunshot in the stillness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Nathan's breath quickened. He could feel the panic rising, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm him, and then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet that filled the house. Nathan stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with terror as he stared into the darkness of the hallway. He could feel it, the presence watching him, waiting. It was there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nathan knew he had to move, had to get out of the house before it was too late. But his legs felt like they were made of lead, his feet rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then, in the silence, he heard it, a whisper, soft and low, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down his spine. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was cold, devoid of emotion, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, suffocating him. It was a voice that didn't belong to anyone or anything human. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as the words sank in. He could feel the blood draining from his face, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He had to get out. Now. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Nathan turned and bolted for the front door. He didn't care about the noise, didn't care about anything except getting out of the house. His hands fumbled with the lock, shaking uncontrollably as he tried to turn the key, but before he could get it open, he felt the cold, clammy grip on his wrist again, pulling him back, dragging him away from the door. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror that echoed through the house, but no one could hear him. The grip tightened, pulling him into the darkness, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the reflection in the hallway mirror, a face, pale and twisted, with hollow, empty eyes, staring back at him. Nathan's world went dark, his scream cut off abruptly as the cold engulfed him. The last thing he felt was the icy fingers around his throat, squeezing the life out of him as the darkness swallowed him whole. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.